Genesis chapter number 50. Genesis chapter 50. I don't know if anybody's noticed it. We live in a weird world today. I have to comment on this. It seems like there's not a day goes by where someone gets offended about something, or they carry an offense about something someone said, something someone did. I mean, we see it in the political spectrum, it seems constantly. I don't think there's an hour that goes by, and I mean, you take your pick of any news network and you'll see that they are continually and constantly discussing those things and talking about those things. But the reality of it is perhaps one of the biggest battles that you are going to face in your life is the struggle to forgive those who have wronged you. And I'm telling you, it's going to be a battle. It's going to be a downright, knockout, drag-out fight.
Right.
The flesh likes to hold on to things. It likes to stew, and it likes to fester. It likes to simmer. The Bible, of course, however, commands us that we are to forgive others. We are to, we are to forgive. In Ephesians chapter 4, 32, look over at Ephesians chapter 4 with me. I'm going to look through a few passages here before we get into really just a couple principles that we can take with us. But in Ephesians chapter 4, we'll start in verse 31. It says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, and be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." It goes on in chapter 5, verse 1, it says, "Be therefore followers of God, as dear children." It follows from that, and if God forgave us, how many people can testify to that? Amen. If God forgave us, then, our responsibility, our practice of living is to forgive others. Notice what the Bible tells us in Colossians chapter 3. Look over at Colossians chapter 3. Flip ahead to Colossians chapter 3. And look at verse number 12. The Bible says, "Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering." And then notice what it says in verse 13, "Forbearing one another and forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye." Some of the most scariest words in all the Bible. Am I right? Because the Bible's saying, hey, listen, if somebody you have a quarrel with somebody, you are to forgive them. Just like Jesus Christ forgave you, you are to forgive them. But the reality of it is sometimes that's just not what you want to do, is it? What prevents the act of forgiveness from being extended? Why is it that people today can often find it hard to forgive others when they do them wrong? And listen, I'm not talking about just people in general, but listen, it's going to be a battle with believers today. And listen, as believers, we understand what it means to be forgiven. We ought to be ready to forgive. I want you to look in our text this morning in Genesis 50. I read verses 15 through 21, but if I can bring you up to speed, just kind of give you a brief introduction as to what has happened. Beginning, I'm not going to turn there this morning, but you can go home today and you can read this from Genesis 37 through to Genesis 50. You can see it all recapped, but of course we know Jacob had 12 sons. The oldest from Rachel was Joseph. And the Bible talked about how he was a dreamer. And of course, God came to him and he gave him visions, and he spoke to him in dreams. And Joseph had spoken about some dreams that he had to his brethren and to his father, and it had to do with them bowing before him. Now, I don't know about you, but when you go to your older brothers and you tell them about how one day they're going to bow before, it doesn't always sit very well, does it? Joseph and Benjamin, of course, his younger brother from Rachel, were already the favorites. So it just caused more hatred and more resentment to swell up among his brother. And of course, one day it reached a boiling point. When they were all out in the field, Joseph came along, and of course they threw Joseph into a pit and eventually sold him to merchantmen that were traveling through, and they proceeded to take him down to Egypt. Of course, he was a servant in a house there, and he got falsely accused and was thrown into jail, and after spending years in jail, he was finally released, and of course, he got exalted to this place where he was basically number 2 in all of Egypt, as far as authority was concerned. He answered only to the Pharaoh, who would have been the king of Egypt. And then, of course, in a twist of irony, his brethren came to Egypt because there was a famine in the land, and they were seeking food. Joseph, of course, had control over the food supply. And after a couple of meetings, Joseph revealed himself to his brethren. And he eventually brought all his brethren, their houses, everybody of his father's house, he brought down to Egypt. And of course, they dwelt in a place that was apart from Egypt, but in Egypt it was Goshen. The time came while in Goshen that Jacob died. And as we come to our text here, Joseph's brethren are now thinking, now that dad is taken out of the picture, you got the most powerful man in all of Egypt, is going to start thinking about all the things that his brethren were responsible for. And maybe some of those memories of what had taken place with Joseph would start to be rehashed. And they're starting to think that, hey, we are in trouble. He's going to come gunning for us. They come to Joseph, and really they're scared. They're concerned. They're concerned what Joseph might do, but we understand that Joseph had long ago forgiven them. I honestly believe when he revealed himself to them, he had forgiven his brothers. But this morning, I want you to take note of what Joseph told his brethren here in our text here. And really, I just want you to grab 2 principles from this passage. Because there's really just 2 we need to pick up that will help you when you get to the place in your life where you are having a hard time forgiving somebody else. You remember these 2 principles, and it will help you as you struggle with forgiveness. Number 1. Notice what he says in verse 19. And Joseph said unto them, fear not. Notice what he says, for am I in the place of God. Here's the first principle that I want you to get from this. And I'm going to describe it like this. It's not about me.
Right.
Okay? If you want to get to the place where you can forgive somebody, you need to get that mentality in your head that it's not about you. That's basically what Joseph was. Am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of a supreme authority figure, someone who is all-important, someone who, is omnipotent? No, he's not. Listen, he's not making that claim. Think of all the things that Joseph had been through. He had been betrayed by the very brethren that are standing before them at this point. They went from wanting to slay him. Of course, Judah was ready to take his life, many of them were ready to take his life, and then Judah, I believe it was Judah that had the idea, well, let's sell him. And they went from wanting to slay him to be ready to profit from him. He was betrayed by Potiphar and his wife. You can read about that in Genesis 39. And of course, even through all that, Potiphar had such a great trust in Joseph, and all that quickly vanished at the presence of those accusations by his wife. When he got to prison, he just asked for that butler to remember him, and of course he forgot about him when he interpreted those dreams for him. Basically betrayed by the butler. Betrayed by his brethren, betrayed by Potiphar, betrayed by the butler. And I'm thinking by this point, Joseph is probably starting to think that there's something wrong with me. He's probably thinking I have a complex here, or developing a complex. Seems like everywhere that he turned, he always drew the short straw. It never turned out good for him. But let me say this, if Joseph was consumed with Joseph, you can be sure that he would have given up long before he made it to the prison. If it had been all about Joseph, I'm sure it would have been over for Joseph well before he made it as a servant in Potiphar's house. When Pharaoh called to interpret a dream, if it was about Joseph, I'm thinking at this point, Joseph's response would have said, you know what? Why don't you go interpret it yourself? But as we read through the account, we understand Joseph just kept plugging. He just kept doing that which was right. And I think one of the reasons why individuals never get to the place where they can forgive other people is because they get stuck on what happened to them. They get stuck on the difficulties that they have had to undergo. The things that came upon them, and the discomfort and the distress and the hurt that they have felt. And the truth is they can't look past themselves. Listen, I'm not trying to trivialize any pain or suffering anybody has gone through. But folks, we need to realize today that we live in a world that will make it tough for people to forgive one another. We live in a society that really makes it hard to forgive somebody else. There are really two things that help resist the humility it takes to forgive. The world will encourage you to think and consider only about yourself. Listen, I have said this many times from this pulpit, but the world today wants to tell you and convince you that pride is a wonderful thing. Listen, this world today wants you convinced that pride is something that is of value, something that's important, and you have to have pride. The second thing is that we live in a society that is all about the rights and the entitlements of the individual. I hear it every single day where someone is talking about their rights and what they are entitled to. And listen, as the Bible says in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, it says, yea, and all that will live godly. Right. It's an act of will. Will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Now, I want you to understand that those are, as believers, our basic rights. That's really what we are entitled to. When you look at the things that the Apostle Paul went through, you know what? That is really what, our lot should be. I'm reminded of Jesus Christ. Turn over to Philippians chapter 2. I just love reading this passage. Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, talking about the mind of Christ. The Bible says in verse 6, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. But then notice what it says in verse number 7. Made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. I like what Paul said in verse 3 prior to that, where it talks about in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. The fact is that was the mind of Christ. He had that humility. He made himself of no reputation. And the reality of it is today, one of the toughest things that you are going to face as you try to forgive somebody, it's about your reputation. It's about you. So when we take the attitude, who are they to do that to me? It's not exercising humility. It's really the opposite of what Joseph asked. You're putting yourself in the place of God. Listen, you will never be able to forgive anybody as long as you are focused on self. I want you to look over at Luke chapter 23 with me. Luke chapter 23. This is going to show you a few passages. And I want you to see the attitude that's displayed here. Luke chapter 23, look at verse number 33. It says, and when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Look at verse 34. Then said Jesus, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they parted his raiment and cast lots. So here is Jesus Christ hanging on one of the most cruelest forms of torment and torture, one of the cruelest ways to die. Here he is hanging on the cross, and what does he say? Father, forgive them. I want you to shimmy over to Acts chapter number 7 with me. Acts chapter number 7. I want you to see the attitude of Stephen. Notice verse 57, it says, then they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran upon him with one accord, and cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet, whose name was Saul, and they stoned Stephen, calling upon God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And notice verse 60, it says, and he kneeled down and cried with a loud voice. Notice what he says. Lord, lay not this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. I mean, you look at the attitude of Jesus Christ on the cross where he says, Father, forgive them. You look at Stephen as he's getting stoned, and what does he say? Lay not this sin to their charge. Now let me ask you this. When you are struggling with whether or not to forgive someone, let me ask you how your situation compares. How does it compare to Christ on the cross or Stephen being stoned? And I'm willing to bet that for many of us, the reason we cannot forgive is often for things far less serious or far less threatening. Again, I'm not trying to dismiss or minimize any hurt. Back in our text, as his brothers feared vengeance, Joseph understood some things about vengeance. He says, am I in the place of God? In Deuteronomy 32, Moses, in his famous song, talked about how vengeance belonged to the Lord. David repeated that in Psalm 94, verse 1, and Paul, of course, referred to it in Romans chapter 12. I want to remind everyone this morning that vengeance does not belong to us. Vengeance is not ours. It belongs to God. And if you get in your heart, you're going to say, hey, listen, I'm going to even the score. I'm going to settle the score. I'm going to get even with that person who wronged me, that offended me. Listen, what you're doing is you're stealing something that belongs to God. Listen, Joseph understood that he was not in the place of God. It was not his place to take vengeance. It was not about him. Listen, we need to learn that principle. If you want to get to the place in your life where you can forgive other people, you got to get to that place where you realize that it's not about you. It's not about me. The second thing, notice he goes on in verse 20, it says, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Okay, so the first principle, it's not about you. The second principle, it's about God. Here in our text, it was about God's will. You know, twice Joseph makes a statement that he makes in Genesis 50:20. Look back at Genesis 45 with me. Look back at Genesis 45. In verses 5, he says, Genesis chapter 45, verse 5, he says, now therefore be not grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither. Notice what he said. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Listen, Joseph had it figured out long ago. That, listen, the reason he got betrayed by his brethren, the reason he got sold into servanthood, the reason why he spent time in prison was all because God had a master plan. God's will was at the forefront of all of this. Joseph saw the importance of God's will being accomplished. Listen, if you want to be able to forgive, you are going to have to put God's will ahead of your will. You're going to have to put the mind of God ahead of your own ego. Right. Joseph knew that a lot of things that had happened to him, he knew he had been put up with a lot for 13 years, but he also saw that there was a bigger picture. There was something more important than the things that Joseph had suffered. There was something far more important than the things that he had to endure. God was accomplishing something behind the scenes that hadn't been revealed as he was sold to the Ishmaelites, or when he was put in that Egyptian prison, or when he was forgotten by that butler. And as Joseph arrives at Genesis 45, we see that Joseph understands that, hey, God has a greater purpose here. There's something bigger than me. And it's God. God had used Joseph to save his entire family, to preserve Jacob's house, to preserve them alive. You know, I mentioned just earlier how, from Philippians chapter 2, how Jesus became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. He is really our ultimate example. He was begotten into this world. He was despised. He was rejected. He was ridiculed. He was doubted. They blasphemed him. He was tortured. He was mocked. He was beaten. And eventually he was nailed to that Roman cross. And why did it happen? We know that he could have called angels at any time. But he allowed it because there was a greater purpose. There was something beyond him. God had a plan that was bigger than him. You know, I'm reminded of the Apostle Paul. And I'm not going to turn there this morning, but I want to challenge you to read it in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 30. I often call it Paul's resume. But he goes through and he talks about all the things he had to suffer and all the things he had to endure. And we understand that he went from city to city. He was persecuted, he was tormented, and many times he was run out of town. There were probably hundreds of other things Paul could have thought he would rather be doing. But all those infirmities were for the power of Christ, for the will of God, he said in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Listen, if we are going to learn to forgive others, we are going to have to put God's will, God's plan, and God's purpose ahead of our own. And you know what? As I look at the scriptures, I already looked at those passages in Ephesians and Colossians. I understand that it is God's will for us to forgive. And we need to really settle it there. The reason why people will have a challenging time forgiving other people is because it's about them. It's all about the pride. One of the things that will help you to forgive others is when you get a sense that what does God want? What is God's will? What does God want to see happen? As believers, we are commanded to forgive. You know, it is not our responsibility. It's not God's desire for us to hang on to grudges. Many times the reason why believers refuse to forgive is because they just simply like it. It is satisfying to the flesh to not forgive those who trespass against them. As I said, the number one enemy of forgiveness is pride. Joseph understood that. He asked the question to his brother, am I in the place of God? It's not about me. But God had me do all this so I could save you guys alive. It was about God. It was about His will. Listen, just remember those two principles. They'll help you forgive those who have offended you. It's not about you. And it's about God. Right? Let's pray together this morning. Father, I pray that you would help us. Lord, that you would speak to our hearts today. Lord, we live in a world that's quick to take offense, quick to hold grudges. And Father, I imagine that sometimes those grudges, those offenses, are easily found among Bible believers. Lord, I pray that you would challenge us and speak to us. Lord, help us get to the place where we can learn to forgive others. Lord, we just want to be obedient to your will. I pray you challenge us this morning. Bless the invitation. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.